Well, the government is facing lots of questions today over its assisted dying legislation and its decision today to limit the debate on the government's budget implementation bill. Let's follow up with the party House leaders this evening from the foyer of the House of Commons. I'm joined by Kevin Lamoureux. He's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader. Andrew Scheer is the House Leader for the Official Opposition, and Peter Julian is the House Leader for the NDP. Gentlemen, good to see you all.
Good to be here.
Thanks for being with me. Mr. Lamoureux, let me start with you. The government's being criticized today by the opposition parties for limiting the debate on key pieces of legislation, such as the assisted dying bill and the budget implementation bill. Let's start there. What's the government's case for using time allocation on the budget implementation bill after attacking the Conservatives when they did it when they were in power?
Yeah, I think that we need to recognize that it is in good part, Peter, about by using time allocation, we're able to manage the business in terms of getting government business through the House. When you take a look at the budget implementation bill, what we're talking about is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 19 hours of debate that will have been on it, which is virtually twice as much as the Conservative budget implementation pieces of legislation. Ideally, you know, it'd be great to be able to have more time. It's just the constraints that we have, you know, at the end of the day, we've got a number of things that we have to get through the House as the House starts to wind up.
Right, but you were one, Mr. Lamoureux, you were the one of the most fervent speakers against time allocation when you were on the opposition side of the House.
But even
and the argument then was to be able to manage the government agenda. What's changed?
Absolutely, because even back then when I was in opposition and I talked about the use of time allocation, I often made reference to the fact that when you sit down as a government House leader and you work with the opposition House leaders, one of the things you want to do is to be able to negotiate some sort of passage of government business through the House. And when there's a high sense of cooperation and all three House leaders can sit down and say, well, yes, we recognize that has to get through. Here are the priorities. You try to work out the time. But when you fail to work out that time, or you fail to be open to working out that time, it puts government into a position of having to bring time allocation.
Mr. Scheer, the government you were part of used time allocation. I should point out for most of that time you were sat in the Speaker's chair, but the Conservatives used time allocation to push along the Conservative agenda. What's wrong with the Liberals doing?
Well, I think Mr. Lamoureux might be applying a bit of a broad brush into the amount of debate that previous budgets were discussed for. This is an awfully short period of time. This is a new government's first budget. There are elements in here that need to be discussed. We're thinking that maybe they don't want this budget to have a lot of attention. You know, they've blown past their $10 billion campaign promise to cap deficits. It's going to be much bigger than that. They probably don't want a lot of attention to that. But what Mr. Lamoureux just said about the time allocation being used when negotiations break down or the cooperation breaks down, that's why this is so shocking to us, because up until now, up until this point, there had been, I had thought from my perspective, good faith conversations about the timing of bills, the number of speakers that would be put up from each caucus, and then very quickly, all of a sudden, we were dealing with time allocation motions, and that's what I find so disappointing. We had many members who wanted to speak to the assisted suicide bill. We had many more members that wanted to speak to the budget bill. Speeches of substance talking about very important issues, and that's why this is so disappointing.
Mr. Julian, what's your view on what's happening here?
Well, Liberal candidates went across the country last October saying that they would bring a new tone to the House of Commons, that they would change from what we saw was bulldozer politics under the former Conservative government. And I think the opposition parties, and I'll even credit the Conservatives on this, were willing to work with Liberal government. What we're seeing is the Liberal government is not willing to work, is not willing to keep its commitments to bring a new tone to the House of Commons, seems to want to hit the opposition in the face with a shovel every time there is any sort of issue where normally there should be some compromise and some discussion. And by doing so, with C-14, which is a nonpartisan bill, very emotional, as you know, Peter, it brings, or for a lot of members of Parliament, brings back personal memories of loved ones that have gone through suffering or that they have lost. And yet you have the government cutting off debate, refusing to allow an increased sitting on last Wednesday night that would have allowed for more members of Parliament to speak on the bill. So it's simply an approach by the government that belies the commitments that they made to the Canadian public last October.
Peter, there's something that needs to be emphasized here. We tried to introduce a motion that would have allowed members of Parliament, many more members of Parliament, to speak. Both opposition parties decided that they didn't want to support that motion. As a result, we need to recognize that at the end of the day, we have a limited time frame to get a great deal of things done.
Well, that's okay.
And we did afford the opportunity for more speakers.
Okay, so to Mr. Lamoureux's point on C-14, there is a time constraint here, Mr. Scheer. So, is the government right to push this along because it's got a deadline of June 6th hanging over it here to get this passed into law?
I believe that there are other options on the table before they would use time allocation to cut off debate and ram something as important as this through. I'm not a constitutional expert, but I imagine that requesting a further extension, working with us in terms of managing the House without time allocation. I think, as Mr. Julian pointed out, there was an openness and a willingness there to allow members to have their voices heard on that. What Mr. Lamoureux was talking about, the last minute with very little notice, debating till 4 in the morning before members had a chance to even, in some cases, be present to deliver the speeches. I don't think that's a sincere commitment to allow members to speak.
Mr. Julian, what could the government do differently on C-14 in the face of a June 6th deadline?
Well, C-14, they should have allowed that evening of debate. Don't forget, Peter, we're Western MPs, Andrew and I, and there are a lot of Western MPs in the House, and so that's prime time, having a debate at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., at midnight. That means that my voters can actually hear me speak or hear other Western MPs speak in the House of Commons. Instead, as Mr. Lamoureux points out, the government offered up 5 in the morning, which is something that is so disrespectful, I think, of Parliament and disrespectful of the new tone that the Liberals said they would set, that I don't even think it's worth commenting on.
Can I ask about the bill itself? Let's finish on this. Mr. Lamoureux, your government House Leader, Mr. LeBlanc, says he wants it passed, C-14, by the House next week and sent to the Senate. The House Committee so far is allowing no substantive amendments to the assisted dying bill. That's raising the prospects that it'll end up getting challenged in the courts. So let me ask you why it is you're convinced the government has the balance right on this bill and is going to push ahead with it the way it is.
Well, first of all, there have been some amendments, from what I understand, at the committee stage, which is really encouraging.
Well, there have been a few of them, but they haven't been on the big significant issues about advanced consent and a couple of the other key demands that are being made by some. Of course, in fairness, some people want the bill opened up and more permissive, and others want it more restrictive. So it's a bit of a tightrope you got to walk here.
Yeah. Well, I've listened to hours and hours of debate inside the chamber, very much aware in terms of where the concerns are from people. We sent it to committee in anticipation that if there were some things that could be done, that the government would be open to it. I understand that there were a number of amendments that were brought forward. In some people's mind, it didn't go far enough, and others, they would have liked to have seen it go in the other direction. The bottom line, Peter, is that that June 6th date is coming up. It's a constitution. It was a unanimous decision by 9 Supreme Court judges that we had to change the law or bring in a new law. We still have to get it before the Senate. We have to be respectful of the fact that they have an institution that they've got to go through. At the end of the day, this is legislation that we do have to get through.
All right. Mr. Scheer, what's your view on that? Both on whether the government's achieved the balance and what's ahead for this bill?
Look, in general, in the bill, it's very frustrating for me. Parliament has decided on this issue in previous sessions. The Parliament has decided to keep assisted suicide illegal and protect the lives of vulnerable people. The Supreme Court has reversed its own decision from just a few years ago, and now Parliament is dealing with this. So you touched on it. There are members of our caucus with a diversity of views on this. Some feel that it's not restrictive enough. Some feel that it's too permissive. So we've had a healthy debate in our own caucus. We've had a free vote in the House of Commons. Every member is free to vote their own personal beliefs or that represent their constituents. I personally would like to see more protections around conscience rights. And if the Liberals are open to any kind of amendment on this, I think one thing we can all agree on, no matter what we think about the issue itself, that people who have a moral concern about assisting in the suicide of someone else should not be forced to do that. So doctors and nurses should have the ability to follow their own beliefs and opt out of those types of procedures.
Mr. Julian, let me land on you on where you think we're headed with this.
Well, I think we're headed into the same kind of territory we saw under the former government, the Conservative government, under Mr. Harper. There were almost a dozen bills that were rammed through the House and then were rejected by the Supreme Court, as you know, Peter, after the fact, because they simply weren't vetted in the appropriate way. And there have been real concerns raised about whether or not this meets the test of the Supreme Court judgment. Mr. Lamoureux is saying, we've got to hit the date, we've got to hit the date. The question isn't the date itself, it's the quality of the legislation that's coming through the House. And the Liberals refusing amendments mean it's quite likely that this legislation won't pass the test of what the Supreme Court has mandated Parliament to do. And so we're in the same type of zone that we saw under the Conservatives. Rapid fire, ram it through at all costs, rather than having the smart consideration of legislation that Canadians deserve.
Appreciate your time on this tonight. We'll continue to follow where this story takes us, and good of all of you to join me. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Peter.
Thanks.